This evening we're going to be reading. I'm going to start here with When Protestants Argue Like Atheists. Might take a few breaks here and there, but we should be able to get through it fairly quickly. In 1853, the Scottish Presbyterian theologian Alexander Hislop published a pamphlet entitled The Two Babylons, Romanism and Its Origins, that was expanded into a book released after his death in 1903. Give me a second. Most of Hislop's arguments relied on supposed parallels showing that Catholicism was just an ancient Babylonian religion dressed up with Christian language. Fundamentalist authors in the late 20th century took these arguments and put them into popular evangelical tracts. It's very interesting. I remember when I first got interested in Catholicism, I started reading a book called Catholicism and Fundamentalism. It was by what's his name? Carl Keating. Very good book, Catholicism and Fundamentalism. Chick tracts, that's it. Yeah, that's and yes, they were ridiculous. Unfortunately, they were. But the thing is some people actually believed those tracts, and I think that's the kind of the point. Those were combated by Carl Keating in his book, Catholicism and Fundamentalism. So welcome in Zuckerberg and King Doctor. The most popular of these, published by Jack Chick, known commonly as Chick tracts, contain stylized drawings depicting hapless Catholics appearing before God on Judgment Day, discovering they are damned because they belong to a pagan religion. Chick went on to publish tens of millions of tracts containing dubious assertions about the origins of Catholic practices. These include the claim that the Eucharist comes from ancient Egypt, that it was the Babylonian king Nimrod who, quote, came up with the idea of confessionals and celibacy for the priesthood. Where is this guy getting this stuff? This is sad on a whole new level here. Protestants who are sympathetic to Hislop's basic argument, even if they don't endorse all of his conclusions, should be careful, since Hislop also criticizes practices that most Protestants consider innocuous. For example, he condemns the celebration of Easter as a carryover from paganism, claiming that the name of the holiday, quote, bears its Chaldean origin on its very forehead. Easter is nothing else than Aster, one of the titles of Beltis, the Queen of Heaven. End quote. That's really weird. I thought Easter was celebrating the resurrection of Christ, but hey, you know, if we're just going to take basic stuff and dress it up in weird language, I suppose this gentleman takes the cake. Atheists who believe that Christ never existed, called mythicists, right? There are those who think that Jesus was just a myth, technically a zombie, underneath the umbrella corporation, of course. Jesus never existed claim there are damning parallels between the story of Jesus and others, of stories of other dying and rising gods. But instead of reading about this in a pamphlet like Hislop's, you're more likely to come across mythicist arguments through online videos such as Zeitgeist, which claims, quote, and there's a bit to this quote, The Egyptian god Horus was born on December 25th of the Virgin Isis Marie. At the age of 30, he was baptized by a figure known as Anup, and thus began his ministry. Horus had 12 disciples. He traveled about performing miracles such as healing the sick and walking on water. Horus was crucified, buried for 3 days, and thus resurrected. This is what Zeitgeist is saying. Now, I know exactly where he's going with this because I listened to almost all of Trent Horn's material, and he's gonna rebut this very quickly. These are just claims that are being made by a YouTuber named Zeitgeist. The Greek god Dionysus was born of a virgin on December 25th, was a traveling teacher who performed miracles such as turning water into wine, end quote. Zeitgeist also claims that the Roman god Mithra was born of a virgin on December 25th. Ancient pagan cults also worshipped the sun, S-U-N, by mourning when it died in the winter and celebrating when it rises in the spring to bring forth new crops. Although similarity between beliefs can be evidence that one culture was the source for another culture's belief, in many other instances it can lead to a bad case of parallelomania. Biblical scholar Samuel Sandmal says this happens when a person falsely believes cultural borrowing has taken place and tries to prove it with highly implausible parallels. Straining to make connections, the parallelomaniac ignores more plausible explanations for why two different religions might have similar beliefs, stories, traditions, or customs. For instance, in some cases, the imagined parallel simply doesn't exist at all. In others, the alleged parallels are so trivial that they don't really serve as evidence for culture borrowing. Or it might, on closer inspection, turn out that the borrowing happened the other way around, such as paganism borrowing from Christianity. Or the borrowing might be real, but related only to non-essential areas of belief. When we apply these alternative explanations, we see that neither Catholicism nor Christianity can be explained as mere offshoots of older pagan practices. Let's start with the first explanation, when parallels never exist in the first place. Many of Zeitgeist's claims about ancient non-Christian religions simply aren't true. There is no evidence the Egyptian god Horus was baptized, had 12 disciples, performed miracles like walking on water, or that he was crucified. In at least one instance, a deity that is supposed to parallel Jesus turns out to have never existed in pagan mythology. Well, where'd this guy get this stuff? Zeitgeist claims that Bedru of Japan and Crete of Chaldea inspired the Jesus story, but there is no record of any deities by these names having a cult of worship. Why would the producers of this film or other mythicists make up stuff like this? Odds are they acted in good faith, but uncritically followed older amateur scholarship that had a bad habit of using poorly documented sources. Many of their claims about Horus, for example, come straight from self-anointed and long discredited scholars from the 19th century, such as Gerald Macy. Contemporary Egyptologists do not trust his work today, and even Macy's peers rejected his scholarship. The renowned British Museum Egyptologist Archibald Sayce, for instance, commended an 1888 article for its thorough demolition of Mr. Macy's crudities and errors. His colleague Peter LaPage Ranouf said of Macy that no lunatic could possibly write more wild rubbish. Man, may it never be said of anything I say or write. When we turn to anti-Catholicism, we see similar uncritical reliance on Hislop's shoddy scholarship. This is evident in claims from chick tracts such as the Holy Eucharist is placed in the center of the sunburst design called the monstrance. Who dreamt this up? The Egyptians called it Osiris long before the popes called it Jesus. Please. Sure enough, Gerald Macy claimed that in Egypt worship, flesh and beer were trans-elemented or transubstantiated by the descent of Ra, the Holy Spirit, and that this sacrament was continued by the Church of Rome. Chick further claims that the Eucharistic host, has the monogram IHS on it because in Egypt these letters stood for the god Isis, Horus, and Seb. However, there is no evidence that ancient Egyptian religion had anything like the Eucharist, much less a host that included a monogram with the Latin letters IHS. In reality, these three letters are often found in Eucharistic hosts because they are derived from the first three letters of Jesus' name in Greek. I mean, come on, people. How dumb can you be? Yeah, I think I would sooner do other things. Because of these blunders, even some of Hislop's defenders came to realize that his thesis was indefensible. One of these people was Protestant author Ralph Woodrow, who adopted Hislop's research and published it in 1966 in the much more readable Babylon Mystery Religion. Several decades later, though, Woodrow realized that the evidence did not support Hislop's claims, and in many cases even contradicted them. This led to the publication of Woodrow's 1997 book, The Babylon Connection, where he denounced his previous book and took Hislop to task for several egregious historical fictions. These fictions included the claim that Nimrod and Semiramis were married Babylonian royalty who created a proto-pagan Catholicism. This isn't possible since, as modern scholars agree, they didn't even live during the same period. Other claims, like Catholic confessionals have a Babylonian origin, ignore the historical reality that the Church practiced the sacrament of confession without confessionals for centuries. The regular practice of confessing privately to a priest in a reserved place was introduced into the Church through Irish missionaries in the early Mid-Ages, not a Babylonian cult in late antiquity. Very fascinating stuff. In many cases, the alleged parallel between Christianity and paganism only exists in the creative mind of the parallelomaniac. In some other cases, though, the evidence from primary sources is accurate, and so a genuine parallel does exist, but the parallel is so trivial or general that it says nothing about any cultural bowering. Ancient pagan deities, for example, may have performed miracles just as Jesus did, but we'd expect that any story about deities interacting with human beings would include miraculous details. So those similarities don't suggest any bowering. Other alleged parallels are true only if you really strain your eyes and your reading comprehension. For example, mysticists say the Persian deity Mithra was born of a virgin, just like Jesus, but the ancient source actually says that Mithra emerged fully grown from a rock. This is only a virgin birth in the most contorted sense of that term. Similarly, the sun and sun, that is S-U-N and S-O-N, are homophones, is true in English, but in most other languages it is not, including ancient languages like Greek and Hebrew. A similar error occurs in the identification of Easter with Ishtar, and honestly, the two sound similar only if you are prone to slurring your speech. Even more fatal to this alleged parallel is that nearly all European languages call the celebration of Christ's resurrection a variant of the Latin word Pascha. Christ is our new Passover, our Paschal Lamb, as St. Paul describes him in 1 Corinthians 5:7. Easter comes from older Germanic words signifying springtime and the dawn. Modern scholarship has also shown that Christian and Catholic beliefs are primarily rooted in Judaism, not paganism. In his study on ancient resurrection belief, T.N.D. Mettinger put it this way, quote, "There is, as far as I am aware, no prima facie evidence that the death and resurrection of Jesus is a mythological construct, drawing on myths and rites of the dying and rising gods of the surrounding world. While studied with profit against the background of Jewish resurrection belief, the faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus retains its unique character in the history of religions. And the same is true of Catholic practices, such that some Protestants falsely decry as being examples of pagan infiltration into the church." Hey, Captain, welcome in. Blessed Easter to you and everyone else here. Many in the Old Testament, for example, Hislop and many other Protestants see Catholic veneration of Mary as a carryover of ancient pagan goddess worship. But in the Old Testament, King Solomon's mother, Bathsheba, was called the Great Lady in Hebrew. A similar title in English found in the British monarchy would be Queen Mother. This great lady sat at the king's right hand and wore a crown, and people even sought her intercession with the king. There is no need to go looking in paganism for a forerunner or type of Mary. It's right in Scripture. It's true that in the pagan world, many goddesses were considered the, quote, Queen of Heaven, end quote, and it is wrong to worship them. But that doesn't make it wrong to appropriately honor the true Queen of Heaven. The Bible refers to pagan rulers like Artaxerxes and Nebuchadnezzar as King of Kings. But this wouldn't make Jesus' title King of Kings a pagan one, or make it wrong to call him by that title. You know, it's interesting, this language of referring to Mary as Queen of Heaven is really rooted into the fact that Jesus is the son of David, right? So he sits on the throne of David. He's a king. Well, in ancient Israel, the mother to the king was the queen mother. That was her relationship to the king. And even though we don't have explicit details of absolutely everything in the New Testament, we definitely see this typology in the Old Testament. And that's what Trent Horn's point is here in talking about the Queen Mother. We have an example with Bathsheba being called the Great Lady during the time of Solomon. In any case, the existence of counterfeit deities does not count against worship of the true king or veneration of the true king's mother. Similarly, if Catholic art depicting Mary holding the infant Jesus is wrong because it superficially resembles pagan duos like Isis and her son Horus, then Christian art depicting Jesus with a halo or wearing white would be wrong because those works superficially resemble art depicting pagan gods like Apollo. In other words, this is just ridiculous attempts to discredit Christianity. While we're on the subject of art, one Protestant website warns its readers, quote, "The next time you are in a Catholic church, take a look around. What do you see? Statues? Candles? A priest shaking the incense burner? People doing all that is a sin." End quote. Yet the Old Testament describes statues being created for the purpose of healing people in Numbers 25:8, and censers being used to spread incense for worship because the smoke symbolizes our prayers rising up to God. Leviticus 16:12 through 13. The fact that pagans used candles and incense doesn't mean that the Old Testament borrowed this worship from paganism. It's reasonable to expect human beings in different eras and cultures to exhibit similar religious tendencies, because it's our nature. God created us to be religious. The Catechism puts it this way, quote, "In many ways throughout history down to the present day, men have given expression to their quest for God in their religious beliefs and behavior, in their prayers, sacrifices, rituals, meditations, and so forth. These forms of religious expression, despite the ambiguities they often bring with them, are so universal that one may well call man a religious being." End quote. Indeed, Woodrow also saw how the parallelmania he embraced earlier in his career could be repurposed against Christianity as a whole. He said, quote, "As Christians, we don't reject prayer just because pagans pray to their gods. We don't reject water baptism just because ancient tribes plunged into water as a religious ritual. We don't reject the Bible just because pagans believe their writings are holy and sacred. If finding a pagan parallel provides proof of paganism, the Lord himself would be pagan." I'm really glad that he redeemed himself from the shoddy ideas that he had before. That's true honesty right there. When you later in your life write a book critiquing the book you wrote 30 years earlier. Some Catholic practices do genuinely parallel pagan practices, but this was consciously done in order to take something good in pagan culture and baptize it for use in Christian worship. Pope St. John Paul II said, quote, "Through enculturation, the Church makes the gospel incarnate in different cultures. It transmits to them its own value, at the same time taking the good elements that already exist in them and renewing them from within." End quote. One example of this enculturation is the Pantheon in Rome, which was once a temple that contained statues of all the ancient gods, but was consecrated to St. Mary and the martyrs in 609. However, this lingering paganism is still a cause for concern for Protestants like Jimmy Swaggart, who said, quote, "An overwhelming percentage of the rites and ceremonies of the Roman Catholic Church are of pagan origin. Cardinal Newman, in his book, The Development of Christian Doctrine, admits that, quote, temples, incense, oil lamps, votive offerings, holy water, holy days and seasons of devotion, processions, blessing of fields, sacerdotal vestments, the censer of priests, monks, and nuns, and images are all of pagan origin." End quote. Swaggart fails to mention or to realize that Protestants have also borrowed elements from paganism that complement rather than contradict their faith. Two examples can be found in Newman's original writing that Swaggart fails to include in the previous quotation. In that excerpt, Newman speaks of, quote, "the use of calendars, or giving the ring of marriage, things Protestants do and have no problem with, as pagan practices that Catholics adopted." I like the idea that certain practices can be adopted, right? So let's say certain behaviors or vestments or a certain liturgical setting were used in pagan settings. And then a whole bunch of them become Christian at the same time. And some of those things can still be useful in the context of worship. For whatever reason, some people they create this kind of distinction in their mind that somehow that just because something may have been seen or may have been done, that, oh, that belongs to Satan now. Like genuflecting before Christ in the Eucharist. Like that behavior of genuflecting. Well, that was used during the time of the Romans, and they were worshiping the emperor, and so therefore you can't do that. And it's like, you're going to give everything away that is a perfectly normal human behavior that expresses respect and so on and so forth. And so some people, they just get crazy that they absolutely can't make those kinds of distinctions in their own mind, that you can baptize things that are really, really good. All right, so you have a question regarding religious symbols. I had for a while. I found out that the pentagram used to be Christian symbol at one point, representing the 5 wounds of Christ. I haven't heard that. However, it was used prior by the Babylonians, ancient Chinese and Japanese religions, Pythagoras, the ancient Greek philosopher, and now devil worshippers. Would it be sinful to adopt such a symbol as Christian, or would God regard it as just a symbol? Well, symbols are just symbols, right? So everything that you just wrote right there are you're using symbols, right? They're symbols and sounds are meant to convey meaning. In some cultures, they may carry no meaning whatsoever because there's no meaning associated with such sounds, because they speak a totally different language. Symbols and sounds are just vehicles for the expression of meaning. So everything you just wrote there is absolutely nonsensical to somebody who speaks Chinese or Japanese. Right? Those jots, those tittles, they mean nothing. We know, as those who speak English, that there are certain meanings attached to those jots and tittles. The same thing is with the corresponding sounds to those jots and tittles. But they only have meaning because we give them meaning. Because there's so many different languages, it doesn't matter. We're just communicating something. And there's many ways in which things can be expressed. A picture can express 1,000 words, for instance. So no, I don't have any problems with certain symbols or words or anything being baptized and utilized, infused with Christian meaning, and then reused, because a symbol is just a symbol. It's not evil in and of itself. It's how one uses it. And I find it absurd that we should just abandon all things to Satan. We're just going to abandon everything to Satan. If he found it in some Babylonian text somewhere, well, we just give him that part of human creativity. I don't see any value in that whatsoever. Another example would be church buildings themselves. Early Christians worshipped in private homes, not set-apart buildings. The very first author to use the phrase "go to church" was Clement of Alexandria in the 3rd century. That's a fascinating expression. The idea of a building whose sole purpose was for communal worship as opposed to a home that doubled as a place for worship was not known in Christianity until the 4th century. Of course, pagans had been using them for centuries. Okay. But so what? Even in the natural religious impulses of pagans, God was preparing humanity for his revelation and for true worship. The 19th century Protestant historian Philip Schaff noted that, quote, "There lurked in those pagan festivals themselves, in spite of all their sensual abuses, a deep meaning and an adaptation to a real want. They might be called unconscious prophecies of the Christmas feast, unquote. Oh, is that right? Full of decadent. Yeah, that's funny. Saint C.S. Lewis reached a similar conclusion when he said that God had revealed himself indirectly to pagans through their myths, and that the gospel were now God's direct revelation. You know, what's kind of interesting is that I don't remember who said it, but it was somebody who said, it may have been Justin Martyr or someone like that, but that while God gave the law to the Jews, he gave philosophy to the Greeks, for instance. It's very possible that God at different times have influenced the flow of cultures and things that prepared the way to receive his revelation. They were, as he said, myth became fact. I'll close with his advice that shows that Catholics and Christians have nothing to fear from pagan parallels. We must not be nervous about parallels and pagan Christs. They ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. We must not, in false spirituality, withhold our imaginative welcome. So far, we've seen that Protestants accuse Catholicism of being a warmed-over version of paganism. In return, sometimes Catholics claim that Protestantism is just a new form of the old Gnostic heresies from the first few centuries of the Church. Gnostics emphasized a secret knowledge of salvation and a preference for the spiritual over the material. Some modern Protestants say that Christianity isn't a religion, but a relationship. And so salvation is about knowing God personally through faith. Protestants also have an aversion to mediated or material means of encountering God, such as sacraments, especially in the Mass, sacramentals, and venerating icons and relics. So on the one hand, it isn't entirely unfair to compare Protestantism to Gnosticism. Calvinist author Michael Horton says that, quote, critics of modern American religion are basically on target in describing the entire religious landscape from New Age or liberal to evangelical and Pentecostal as entirely Gnostic. The Protestant author Philip Lee even wrote a whole book on the subject in 1987 called Against the Protestant Gnostics. Lee pointed out that Protestants do have a tendency of spiritualizing and subjectivizing Christianity in a way that downplays its material and corporal elements. There are parallels between Protestantism and Gnosticism, just as there are parallels between Catholicism and paganism. But Catholics argue like atheists when they try to compartmentalize all the Protestantism under the Gnostic label. It may be the case that some Protestants have, perhaps unintentionally, fallen into the same thinking as Gnostics, but this wouldn't mean that Protestantism itself is Gnostic in nature or to the root, only that it needs to be purified of these disordered ways of thinking. One feature of ancient paganism was mindless ritualism. Our Lord even warned his audience to not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Yet some Catholics do end up unintentionally treating the rosary as an incantation to be uttered instead of a set of mysteries for spiritual meditation. In some cultures, Catholics do treat statues and images in a way that overstates their intrinsic power, as pagans treated idols. But neither of these things prove that Catholicism is pagan. It only proves that human tendencies can infect any kind of godly worship. Just as Catholics are nothing like pagans in many important ways, so too do Protestants differ from Gnostics in important ways. Unlike the Gnostics, who disparaged marriage and prized celibacy, Protestants insist upon marriage too much and value celibacy not enough. The Gnostics restricted salvation to hidden knowledge that was given only to the properly initiated, whereas Protestants have historically worked to make the gospel as publicly accessible as possible through things like tracts, hotel room Bibles, and open-air revivals. So although it may be valid to point out where Protestants or Catholics have inadvertently fallen into bad pagan habits, it's not valid to cite superficial pagan parallels as the primary way to discredit an entire belief system. All right, folks. That's all I have time for. I hope you enjoyed that reading. I didn't have much to reflect on. I think he did a pretty decent job with his flow of thought. Be intellectually honest when you look at other people in their thoughts. Develop mutual understanding. Don't be so quick to attribute to other people. You don't attribute to malice what could be attributed to ignorance, and in the case that people do know, just be a little bit more charitable in dialogue with other people. The kinds of stuff that Jack Chick and this Macy guy did was absolutely ridiculous, and thankfully this, what was that guy's name? Woodrow? Yeah, he completely redeemed himself, and if somebody is really going to reject Protestantism or Christianity in general or Catholicism, know what it is. Don't make decisions based on what it isn't. So with that, God bless everybody. We'll see you again.